Hey everyone, so today we're going to look at square roots and irrational numbers. So for this lesson you will need your notebook, a pencil, and a calculator. So let's look at the first word, perfect square. The square of an integer. So what does this mean? That means like 4 squared is 16, 2 squared is 4, 6 squared is 36. This means that 4 times itself will give you 16. That 2 times itself will give you 4, and 6 times itself will give you 36. So 6 times 6. That's what a perfect square is. Square root is the inverse of squaring a number, so it's the opposite of what we did up here. So the square root of 16 will give you 4, the square root of 4 will give us 2, and the square root of 36 will give us 6. So you want to make sure that you wrote this down in your notes. So simplifying square roots. So when you simplify square roots, you're going to use your calculator. So you need to have that out and look for the square root button. If you're having trouble finding it, I can help you to find it tomorrow. So when I type in the square root, I'm going to hit the square root sign and then type the number 64. And I'll get an answer of 8. But I know by my integer rule that if I have two negative numbers, so a negative 8 times a negative 8, that I'll get a positive 64. So the square root of 64 can be a positive 8 and a negative 8, because the same sign gives me a positive number. So if I take the square root of 625, my calculator tells me 25, but I also know that negative 25 times negative 25 gives me the positive 625. So what would the square root of 81 be? Type it into your calculator and see what you get. So you should have gotten 9, but we also know that negative 9 times negative 9 gives us 81. So when we simplify square roots, we know that it can have two answers. So notice the difference of this one. This has the negative sign on the outside. So that means I'm going to take the square root of what's inside. So type that into your calculator, the square root of 121, and you will get 11. But this negative number on the outside is an imaginary negative 1. That means I'm going to take negative 1 times whichever number is here, and I'll get negative 11. So anytime you see the negative sign on the outside, you're always just going to add that to your answer. So here, I know it's going to be a negative. What's the square root of 100? 10. So it's negative 10. Why don't you go ahead and try these on your own? So now would be a good time to hit the pause button and write your responses down in your notebook. So for your answers, the square root of 49 is 7, and the negative's on the outside, so I got a negative 7. Square root of 169 is 13, but I also know that a negative 13 times a negative 13 means I'll get a positive number. So 13 and negative 13. So when we're estimating square roots, sometimes it doesn't come out to be a whole integer, so we can round to the nearest whole integer. So let's first ask ourselves, the square root of 10, we know that's not a perfect square. So what is a perfect square that we know it'll be around? Well, first let's figure out what is the square root of 10. So type it into your calculator and see what you get for the square root of 10. So on your calculator, you should have gotten 3.162. Do we know rounded to the nearest whole? Look next door, 5 or greater, add 1 more, if that stays the same. So the square root of 10 is about 3. Now, if I were going to use my perfect squares, I would say, okay, what is this between? So, 3 times 3 gives me 9. So I know the square root of 9 is 3. And then, well, let's see, 4 times 4 is 16. So the square root of 16 is 4. So I know that it's going to be in between 3 or 4. Because these are my two perfect squares that the square root of 10 falls under. So let's look at the square root of 39. We're taking the opposite because there's a negative there. So type into your calculator, what is the square root of 39? So again, find the square root button on your calculator and type it in. So you should have gotten 6.244. So again, I want to round to the whole. So I look next door, 5 or greater, add one more. So it's just 6. So the square root of 39 is about 6, but then I have a negative, so I know it's going to be about a negative 6. Why don't you go ahead and round these to the nearest whole, and you may use your calculator to do so. So for these answers, when you type in the square root of 55, you should get 7.416 and some more numbers. So again, look next door, 5 or greater, add one more, otherwise it stays the same, so it's about 7. Looking here, square root of 12 will give us about 3.464. So again, look next door, 5 or greater, add one more, it stays the same, so we know it's going to round to 3, but there's a negative, so it's about a negative 3. So now I want to find the square root of fraction. So what you do when you're finding the square root of fraction is you're going to find the square root of the top number and the bottom, of the numerator and of the denominator. So the square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of 100 is 10. Well, like all fractions, I want to make sure that in simplest form, yes, so my answer is 7/10. So let's look at this one. Again, I want to find what the square root of 36 is and what the square root of 81 is. So we're going to use our calculator. The square root of 36 is 6, and the square root of 81 is 9. Now I look at this, 6, 9. Is this in simplest form? No, because I can divide the top and bottom by 3 to get 2/3. It isn't wrong if you have 6, 9, but you always want to make sure you simplify your answer. Go ahead and try these two on your own. So you should have gotten 5/7 and 3/4. So let's look at comparing square roots. So when you compare square roots, we want to know which one is greater, the square root of 18 or 4 4/10. So in order to do this, we want to figure out what is the square root of 18. So on your calculator, find the square root of 18. It's going to be about 4, we'll round to 1,000, 243,000. So which one is greater, 4 4/10 or 4 and 243,000? When we look at the decimal, we know 4 is greater than 2, so 4 and 4/10 would be greater than the square root of 18. If it's hard for you to look at a decimal like this, you can line them up so that we can see 4 and 4 is the same number, 2, 4, this one's less, so this one's the greater number. So let's look at this one, the square root of 20 or 4 and 7/10. Which one's greater? So the square root of 20, around to the thousands again, will give us 4 and 472,000. I'm going to line up my decimals to make it easier to look at. These numbers are the same. This is greater. So 4 and 7/10 is greater. Why don't you go ahead and try this one on your own? So you should have seen that the square root of 58 is greater. Because when I type this in, I get 7 and 616,000. Line up my decimals, these are the same, this one's greater, so the square root of 58 is greater. Now yesterday you already wrote this down in your notes, so you do not need to write this down, but I am going to go over it again. The rational number, again, it can be expressed as a ratio of two integers, so rational numbers can be written as a fraction. If you didn't write this down the first time you saw this, you want to make sure you get this in your notes. Make sure you hit pause and write this down. So if it's not rational, it's irrational. And the only difference is that irrational numbers cannot be written as a fraction. So non-repeating decimals and non-terminating decimals are irrational. So here it looks like it repeats, but we have a 2, 1, 1, and then a 2, 1, 1, 1. This is not a repeating decimal. Pi is not repeating, and the square root of 18 is not repeating, because if you type in the square root of 18 on your calculator, you're going to get 4.2, 4, 2, 6, and the numbers keep going and going. It doesn't end. So let's try these together, and we're going to do an activity in class with this more tomorrow. We'll try 4 together. So, 53/100. Is this rational or irrational? Can it be written as a fraction, or can it not be written as a fraction? It is rational. Can be written as a fraction. Square root of 81, rational or irrational? Well, the square root of 81 is 9. 9 is a whole number. It can be written as a fraction, so it's rational. 1.0110111, is that rational or irrational? Is it a repeating decimal or not? Not, so it would be irrational. It has 2 1s and then 3 1s. And then pi. Is pi rational or irrational? You learned on the last slide that pi is irrational. I want you in your notebook to write 3 irrational numbers between 9 and 10. We will go over your responses tomorrow in class, so I want to make sure you took your notes, go back and listen to anything that you need to, write down any questions, and then make sure you go to the website and click on the link to answer the 5 questions that correlate with this video. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.